again, still with Israel as being a fantastic big problem. Well, it's not so much Israel, it's the rest of them. People are feeling that there are two camps here, Sid, operating. We see who are friends and who are our enemies in all this. Israel has done fantastically well, but what's being employed against them is horrendous. And can I say that Joe Biden is responsible for so much?
Yes, well, it's interesting. Obviously, we've moved on this last week from focus on Gaza to focus on Iran. And interestingly enough, I had got an email from the Jerusalem Prayer Breakfast, which included in it an invitation from Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, for people to send short 1-minute clips saying that they were praying for Israel, because he said, we need prayer at this time. This was a request direct from the Prime Minister. And I prayed and said, right, God, what do you want me to put in this clip? And the Lord gave me Isaiah 54, verse 17, which is, no weapon formed against you will prosper. You will confound every tongue that rises against you in judgment. This is a heritage of the servants of the Lord, and their vindication from me, says the Lord. So I put that into a video and sent it to Albert Wexler at the Jerusalem Prayer Breakfast. I did it before the Iranian attacks. This was done on Friday. And I got a message back from him, which said, thank you so much. He said, that word that you gave us was absolutely confirmed when the attacks came on Saturday. And it's interesting. I also sent it to Ron Cantor, who is from Shalanu TV, which is God TV in Israel. And he sent me a message back saying, that is the second time in the last minute that I've received this same word. So let nobody be in any doubt. God is protecting Israel at this time. And those attacks from Iran, 300 missiles, they said 99% were shot down. I believe the only one that got through was one that was sent into a military base in southern Israel. And I believe some drones landed there, but no one was injured. So it's a miracle, really, that 300 missiles were fired and not a single one caused any injury. So hallelujah. And by the way, I know you mentioned Biden, but it is interesting that America and Britain were involved in shooting down these missiles. I mean, the UK have confirmed that they had ships in location, America had ships in location and were shooting down the missiles. But Biden has now said he will not support any Israeli retaliation. But I personally think that is right, because I think it would be foolish for Israel to retaliate against Iran and escalate the war at this time. They've got to retaliate against Hezbollah. They have to sort out what's going on with Hamas, but to start escalating a war with Iran, in my view, would be foolish.
Sid, my reference to Biden in all this was the damage done years ago when he's been cozying up, giving way, just letting them get away with what they've been doing. He's not been a Trump to face things down. Trump would have made a big deal of difference to the whole scenario that has existed and is existing now if he'd have been re-elected last time.
You know, I agree with that totally. Sorry, yes, I wasn't talking about Biden's relationship with Iran. I was talking about Biden's relationship with Israel. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, Biden's relationship with Iran has been terrible. You see, Biden's approach to foreign policy across the world has been to try and bribe his enemies to do what he wants. And in the case of Iran, he was actually sending them billions of dollars. I mean, literally $6 billion was sent not long ago to Iran to try and get Iran to support American policy. And Trump had a very different policy. Trump's policy was sanctions. And he says that the sanctions on Iran were biting. He'd got Iran into a position where they were willing to do whatever he wanted in order to get the sanctions lifted. So it wasn't costing America any money, and it wasn't rewarding Iran for their terror, which is basically what Biden has done. So absolutely, I mean, and the Obama Iranian deal was a terrible deal. All it was doing was going to delay Iran getting nuclear missiles for a period of time. Trump was desperately trying to stop them with his sanctions, and he believed he was stopping them. But with Biden's policy, Iran is now on the verge of having nuclear weapons if they haven't already got them. So his whole policy has been a complete failure as far as Iran is concerned.
Let's skip from Israel to some problems in the UK at the moment. A world record, I think, has been set here in that we have another new housing minister in the United Kingdom. Believe it or not, it's the 16th one in 13 years. Minister of Housing. It's in a real mess. It is in several countries actually at the moment. But particularly in Britain, we've got a mega problem with housing. And it's complex, as most of these things are. But we've always had a bit of a 5 large building company monopoly, if that's the right way of saying things. This is a 5-tier monopoly. The big boys have control, and behind the scenes, they are cooperating with each other. Now, the famous thing, of course, is to keep land until it arrives at a sufficient price that they're going to make a mega profit on their houses when they eventually get round to building them. Every government's tried to stop that lark, but it still goes on. But we've got Lee Rowley back in charge. That's a second bite of the cherry in amongst the 16th ministers. He's having another go because the whole thing fascinates him. And he's determined, bless him, to bring good out of bad. And he's identified 3 main problems. Number 1, surprisingly, quality of the houses. They're rubbish compared with most other building in Europe. Everything seems to be done on the cheap, Sid. Thin walls, paper walls. Well, you tell me. I'm exaggerating, of course, but one only has to look at the architecture of many, probably 80% of new buildings, and the windows are tiny. They're boxes. They're awful. Anything to make it cheap. So quality, 4 out of 10. Then he says the problem is planning. Well, he's dead right about that. The problem has been planning for decades, and it ain't got any better, despite subsequent governments saying, oh, we'll alter this, make it easier to get planning permission. Well, it isn't. Whether the latest thing is there's not enough people, civil servants working in the departments. There's always an excuse. But lo and behold, he's identified the biggest problem. Immigration. Well done. How courageous. You can't expect to get away with putting 10 million people in a country, housing them, doctoring them, schooling them, and get away with it. And well done him. But is anything going to be done about it, Sid?
Yes. Right. Well, first of all, I'd like to talk about planning, because that is it is a big interest of mine, because I was at one time a councillor and shadow chairman of a planning committee, and I took a very keen interest in the whole planning system, and it's extremely important to get it right. I mean, one of the things that became clear to me as a councillor was that in every planning decision, it was very important that I was involved. So I was at least listening to both sides. And in most situations, it's not straightforward. And there are arguments for one side, there's arguments for the other side. But it's very important to be involved, to listen, and to think about what is sensible and what isn't sensible. Now, I've come to the conclusion in general, the first thing that needs to be said is that the quality of our house building now has no comparison compared with what was going up in the 50s and 60s with those tower blocks. And I think it was Macmillan that was extremely focused on number of units. And because he was so focused on the number of units that he was building, I mean, at that time, to be fair, what they were trying to do was clear the slums. So there were slums where people literally didn't have bathrooms in their houses and so on and so forth. And they had to clear them out and get new houses which had bathrooms. That was the focus. The problem was what they built was just terrible, terrible housing. And most of that has now been demolished. So the last thing we want to do is to be building houses which in 20 years' time, they're all going to have to be demolished because they're such low quality. So you're right to draw attention to the quality, but I seriously believe that the quality now is way better. Now, I'm a big believer in the importance of building houses close to stations so that we're not having a situation where everybody in the house has got to drive and drive a long distance to get anywhere for where they're working, where they're shopping, wherever they're going. If you build houses close to stations, then people can hopefully walk to do their shopping and walk to the train station and get to where they want to. Now, I've seen an enormous number of tower blocks being built around Tottenham Hale Station, for instance, and also around Canary Wharf. And I've been into some of these, and the quality is extremely good. I mean, they're normally now built with a lot of security, and also with a gym, even with a swimming pool in the case of a tower block I've seen in Canary Wharf, and it's and the flats are very, very nice. Now these days, people aren't as interested in gardens as they were at one time. And at one time, you know, people wanted a nice garden. People don't want a nice garden these days. People got no real interest in producing their own vegetables, etc. Or at least if they are, they're quite happy to have an allotment. But people don't expect to buy a house with a big garden, so or any garden at all. We're quite happy to have a veranda that might have a few plants on it. And there's nothing wrong with building tower blocks close to stations. And I believe in the size of land, the size of country we've got, that is the right way to deal with the housing crisis. Because if what you do is to build a lot of houses on meadows, on farmland, then frankly, that is just destroying the countryside, and in essence, it's destroying the country. And that is something we should not be doing. Now, as far as the other issue is concerned, the issue of immigration, I totally agree that the number of people in this country is basically, at the moment, we're at capacity. We can't afford to be taking a lot of people in, a lot more people in. And it doesn't make sense anyway, because if the people we're taking in from, say, Africa, which a lot of people seem to be coming in from Africa, but even from Eastern Europe, I mean, when I went to Romania, I found that Romania seemed to be almost empty. And if you look at the size of the Romanian economy, it's terrible. But it will be a lot better for us to be seeking to support Romanians in Romania and support Africans in Africa and support those countries than to say, oh, come over to the UK. I mean, we just literally can't afford to say to all Eastern Europeans, come over to the UK. You know, it doesn't make sense to those countries, and it certainly doesn't make sense to us. So, you know, we need an international agreement that actually makes sense, because this isn't only going on in Britain, it's going on in countries all over Europe. I mean, Germany is facing a terrible problem, Italy is facing a terrible problem, so Spain, and so is the United States. The United States is facing a massive problem. I mean, they've had 5 million illegal immigrants cross the border from Mexico. So we need some international agreements to deal with these migration issues.
Well, let's mention, before we leave the subject entirely about house building, of course, there's been a betterment in construction. Certainly, there's been a betterment in design. Heat loss is, well, we're famous in Great Britain for our heat loss buildings, full of draft. The modern materials that go into building are fabulous compared with what they were. But we do things on the cheap, Sid. If you look and compare what the rest of Europe does, for instance, with window frames, the quality of the window frames, the British ones are appalling. They're cheap. we seem to be very good at doing cheap in Great Britain. And the houses will not last long. They might be thermally sealed beautifully, but the rest of it, that's the science part, the actual brickying, and they look like arrow slits, some of the windows. I was appalled, actually, and regularly I receive temptations to return to the United Kingdom. We're building new houses. I put myself on a register about 10 years ago, and the building has not got any better. They're advertising properties in the southeast of England at an enormous price. They're clumped together around a green to make it look very nice and countrified. The estate agent put a big picture up of the South Downs, which you can't see because you're all surrounded by big fences. But we sort of get used to that, don't we, with these estate agents? The whole thing is done on the cheap, quickly, and without thought. People getting greedy everywhere, but it seems to have been highlighted in Great Britain. This is just one of the things where greed is overtaking quality.
No, I totally agree with you on that. And you see, one of the problems is that the political priority and indeed the media priority is all based on number of units of houses built. And if you only focus on number of units of houses built, then there is incredible danger that the builders will do what you're saying, cut corners, produce very cheap buildings and so on and so forth. And then 20 years down the line, you've suddenly got a massive problem because you find that all these buildings that you put up are such poor quality, you've now got to take them all down and start again, which is totally, utterly counterproductive. And if people don't know what we're talking about, that's exactly what happened with the buildings that were put up in the 50s and 60s under the very fast drive. I mean, all those buildings now have to be demolished and we have to start again. So what an utter waste of time. I mean, far better to build good quality houses which last. I mean, a good quality house will last 150, 200 years. I mean, you know, to be building houses that only last 20 or 30 years is just a disastrous policy, frankly. So we do have to focus on quality as well as quantity. Absolutely.
The bravery of mentioning immigration, I want to take a bit of an in-depth look at this, because there has been a report that has been hidden from most mainstream presses, and it's come from an absolutely top-rated survey company about the fact that we have 4 million Muslims in the United Kingdom at the moment. We have mentioned this, Sid, on a number of occasions, but perhaps Nigel Farage has really highlighted it with a 3-minute discussion, if we can call it that, pointing out something that may have gone too far, and we may be too late to catch this one. And that is what Islamists, the average Muslim, in fact, believes and wants about himself and about the country he's living in. And we have mentioned, I repeat, that 30% on a survey, indeed conducted by the government, revealed that a caliphate is desired by the portion of Muslims. And we've always said, oh, well, it's the minority. It appears to not be the minority, which we have pointed out. At least half want a caliphate. As we mentioned in the old days, this used to be the T word, the treason word. Not any longer. Most people are supporting Hamas, even though it's an illegal organization. They don't believe the numbers of 1,740 or thereabouts, murders plus rapes, etc. when Hamas invaded Israel. They don't. 3/4 of Muslims in the United Kingdom don't believe that's what happened. We're in a mess, Sid.
Yes. Now, as far as the figures are concerned, I believe figures have shown 30 to 35% of Muslims are what were termed as radical Muslims. In other words, radical Muslims actually believe when the Quran says, kill disbelievers, wage war against those who don't believe in Allah, as for those who disbelieve, cut off their heads, these sort of things. And indeed, also, there's a verse in the Quran which says that the disbelievers will strike terror into their hearts, which is interesting. ISIS have actually quoted that verse. Now, radical Muslims say, yeah, this is what the Quran says, this is what we've got to do. And as a result, they're very violent people. And of course, you know, we are all disbelievers as far as they're concerned. Now, the first thing that people need to understand is that Muslims will behave differently in a country where they're in a minority compared with a country where they're in a majority. So if we really want to see what Islam is like, we've got to look and see how it operates in countries where they're in a majority. And of course, if you look at countries like Pakistan or northern Nigeria, I mean, they persecute Christians terribly. I mean, Christians are considered to be inferior, which of course, again, is what the Quran says. It says that that Christians should be treated as dhimmis, in other words, as inferior species compared with fellow Muslims. And Christians should accept dhimmi status, and if they don't accept dhimmi status, then they should be put to death. I mean, you know, this is what it says, and that's actually what operates in many Muslim countries. Now, of course, they don't operate the same in where they're in a minority, but they're still hoping to point towards this Muslim paradise, which is actually an absolutely awful, terrible state of affairs. Now, obviously, as I say, that doesn't apply to all Muslims. I'm talking about radical Muslims, but it is a very high percentage. And of course, some surveys show a percentage even higher than 30 or 35%, but it does depend on what question you ask. But even the other Muslims that aren't radical Muslims will come under a lot of pressure from the radical Muslims in order to adopt that sort of approach. So many sort of nominal Muslims might be very concerned about speaking out, for instance, against Hamas or speaking out against radical Muslims, because they'll be concerned about what might happen to them. So many of them will go along with the radical Muslims' agenda, even though they themselves might say, oh, no, I'm not interested in any suicide bombing, or I'm not interested in killing Christians or anything like that. I don't want to do that. I don't agree with that. They might well say that. But when it comes to the mosque, in the mosque, they'll probably keep quiet or say nothing or you know, or whatever. But what I find revealing, by the way, while we're talking like this, is that even today, I've been reading, you know, following the Iranian attacks on Israel, there've been a lot of Muslims out on the streets glorifying the attacks, saying how wonderful it is that Iran has attacked Israel like this. And you know, to me, that is absolutely following radical Islam. So anybody that's going out on the streets glorifying Hamas or glorifying Iran's attacks on Israel is basically, as far as I'm concerned, a radical Muslim or supporting radical Islam. Now, some of these people, of course, are from the hard left, from the extreme left, who go along with the radical Muslims' agenda. But in many cases, simply because of ignorance, because they don't even know what they're supporting.
Well, I was seeing some footage over the weekend, and of course, the usual pro-Palestinian march was on there. There was a much smaller march for Israel. And just the simple thing of seeing how Israel were holding up banners and waving them normally, and being very disciplined, if you wish. And then the camera goes round to the other side and you see the reaction from a normal demonstration to completely abnormal. You could see the hate. You could see the way they were chanting, the way the banners were being raised. And I particularly raised this with the police over this weekend. Let's be honest. You dare arrest them because you'd be overrun. you've not got enough policemen. That's how they're getting away with it, Sid. That's how they continually have marches. People have had enough. It's costing millions of pounds to every taxpayer. And you cannot blame the police. And the police said, well, look, we've got a situation here. And this is quite fascinating how it is policed. That, yes, we can see an arrestable offence before our eyes. We can also see 50 other pro-Palestinian marchers behind the one that's committed the offence, hate speech or whatever. But if we go as a single police officer to try and take that one man out of the crowd, there's going to be problems. So what they do is rely on CCTV cameras and get him 2 or 3 weeks after, because the footage is there. Now, that's not satisfactory because the marches go on, but you can understand it from the police point of view.
Yeah, okay. The first thing I'd like to say is that a lot of this is spiritual. I mean, the hatred that Muslims have for Israel is not just logical, it's utterly illogical, and it is spiritual, because we were saying earlier, Israel is the apple of God's eye. God loves Israel, and Jesus is returning to the Mount of Olives, which is in Israel. Jesus' command after he rose from the dead was this message of repentance and forgiveness must be preached in his name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. Jesus said, go to Jerusalem first. And so he went to the Jews first. And but you know, salvation doesn't stay with the Jews, but it's first with the Jews. So it has a very, very important part in God's plan. And Satan hates all of God's plans. And Islam is part of a tool of Satan, I'm afraid. That's the reality of it. And the hatred is terrible, absolutely terrible. You're right. Now, interestingly enough, I mean, last Wednesday when I was in the centre of London, a Palestinian march came past where I was. I was with a group of people doing evangelism close to the London Eye. And this Palestinian march marched really closely, and they were shouting about genocide, about Israeli genocide. And I shouted at them, it's Hamas that supports genocide, not Israel. Interesting enough, I said it more than once. Now, interesting enough, nobody from the march actually reacted, but one of the policemen turned and looked at me, and I'll tell you, if they had reacted, the people on the march, I think the policeman may well have, well, I don't know what he would have done. It wouldn't be surprised if he'd arrested me, but it didn't happen, I'm glad to say. But interesting enough, though, there was something that happened in the spiritual climate. So the Muslims who were near us suddenly started to become aggressive towards us with the evangelism we were doing, which they weren't before. So you can realize there's something changed in the spiritual climate after this march had gone past. So this is evil. What they're doing is evil. It's difficult for the police to cope with it unless they understand what they're dealing with, because the police aren't operating on any sort of spiritual or correct spiritual wavelength, because they, rather than actually facing up to what Islam stands for and what all these pro-Hamas demonstrators stand for, they've got an anti-Islamophobic advisor. So they follow advice to say, well, we mustn't be Islamophobic in the way we police. They've got no interest whatsoever in listening to Christians or supporting Christians.
The other figures and stats before we leave the subject is 3 out of 4 want Islam to be the national religion. And it goes farther. 3 out of 4 want Sharia law in Great Britain. Sid, well, there is a real problem. Yeah. In other countries, they would be exported.
Yeah, so I mean, but actually, interesting enough, the last Archbishop of Canterbury actually said, you know, Sharia law is operating perfectly well in northern Nigeria. There's nothing wrong with having it in the UK. So there's a certain naivety around us. But you see, what people have to understand is that one element of Sharia law is killing disbelievers. And under Sharia law, anyone that leaves the Muslim religion must be put to death. And it actually happens in Muslim countries. You know, if you cannot, you're not allowed to change your religion. Your religion is on your identity documents. I mean, they want this again. You see something they want to introduce into this country: identity documents. If we have identity documents, you're going to have to put your religion on your identity document. So, you know, if your religion on your identity document is Muslim, you are never allowed to change it. So no Muslim is allowed to convert to Christianity. Of course, you can change from Christian to Muslim, and that's no problem at all. You can do that easily, as frequently as you like. But you see, I honestly believe that if these people think that operating under Sharia law, living under Sharia law is such a wonderful paradise, why don't you go to a country where Sharia law is operating and live in that country? You see, there's all these people coming over from Pakistan and Bangladesh to come and live in the UK. Well, why? Because actually it's not pleasant living in a Muslim country. Living in a Christian country is far more pleasant than living in a Muslim country. That's the reality. So why bring Sharia law to this country? It is not a better system. It's a far worse system. That's the truth.
Back to the T word, the treason word. Should they be invited to leave, Sid?
Well, you can only...
Or given the opportunity.
Well, you can only deport people that have committed crimes. But if people have come over here from Pakistan or Bangladesh, even if they've been given leave to remain, or even if they've been given British citizenship, then if they've committed any serious crimes, I mean, and I'm talking about crimes like rape or murder or these sort of crimes, then absolutely they should be deported.
Or treason?
Well, treason's a difficult crime, frankly. I mean, if someone's expressing an opinion, they shouldn't be deported for expressing an opinion. They should only be deported if they actually engage in violence or rape or, you know, or things like that, that are you know, that literally unacceptable. I do not believe somebody should be deported simply for expressing an opinion, no.
There are many over the last few decades within the mosques that are being told literally, yes, we want a caliphate. They're encouraged to do everything they can to bring that about. Now, the preachers that say these things are not touched by and large.
Well, yes, I mean, if in the mosque a preacher is encouraging violence or encouraging people to engage in sexual abuse or this sort of thing, then absolutely that preacher should equally be deported, which has happened in some cases. But absolutely, that is a serious crime. So it's not only those that do the violence; it's also those that encourage the violence. Yes, they should be deported.
Still on a little bit of the same subject, let's tell you what happened in Barcelona last weekend. Now, we're here in Spain. We see this go on the whole time. A cruise ship landed, and there were about 60 Bolivians on that cruise ship with forged visas. The police, the national police, picked this up. They detained them overnight, and they were sent back to Bolivia on an aeroplane paid for by the cruise liner that dropped them off in Barcelona. Now, that would never happen in Britain. But in Spain, we've got lots of stories like that. That's how they go about illegal immigration. Britain is a soft touch. We're in a heck of a mess. And all these clever devices, Rwanda, Cuba, wherever we can send them back with future agreements, ECHR, Spain don't bother with that. For years, they've been taking immigrants, because don't forget, it's only 8 miles across from North Africa at the nearest point. And there you go. They bring them in there. They put them immediately into a centre, give them a shower, check their papers, give them a haircut, and they're back in a week into North Africa. Britain, you're a shambles? Or is the truth that we have a deep state like America, as we mentioned last week, and the deep staters, well, call them what they are. The civil servants, the mandarins, are all part of this. They don't want to see that happening.
Yes, I mean, you see, unfortunately, people haven't got to grips with the simple fact that the people coming over in boats are not the most needy people in the world. And the most needy people in the world can't afford to get on these boats and leave their own country and travel to try and find a better country. They are economic migrants, and economic migration is something that has to be clamped down on worldwide, frankly. Obviously, it's different if somebody's fleeing a war. It's like when people are fleeing the Ukraine war, for instance, or fleeing a war anywhere, and their life is in danger. Then that is what the asylum system is set up for. The asylum system is not set up for economic migrants. It's set up for people whose life is in danger, and it should be applied correctly.
Yeah, difficult times, Sid. I don't think we've been any times as difficult as this, maybe 3 or 4 centuries ago, but we're back there again. Let's go and go to Blighty. We've got an election. Sir Keir is almost certain to get in, and at last, certain policies are going to come out, and in fact, week by week are coming out now to give us a hint of what Labour is all about. The first thing is they want to save £6 billion, and they can do it straight away by stopping the fiasco of school fees. Yeah, really? Half of that will come back. The other half of the 6 million, well, get rid of the non-doms. They've not done the maths, Sid, because if you work out what these people bring to the nation, either through school fees, private school fees, and non-doms, it's way above £6 billion a year. They are putting their ideology above reality again, aren't they?
Yes, it's a lot of it's the politics of jealousy, I'm afraid. You know, all these rich people that have, could afford to send their children to private school, we're going to tax them, and they don't stop and think for a minute. Hold on, wait a minute. If we tax them and they can no longer send their children to private school, then they're going to have to be educated in the state sector, and that will end up costing us a whole lot more. So we won't get an advantage, and some of these schools will probably be forced to close. I mean, some may continue to operate, but some will be forced. Some private schools will be forced to close, and it'll be an extra burden on the state sector. So they won't get a whole lot of extra money at all anyway. And the amounts of money we're talking about are not enormous amounts of money. I mean, I've said before that Quangos in 2010 cost 90 billion. Last year they were costing 224 billion. And in real terms, the 90 billion in 2010 now will be 155 billion. So we're looking at an extra 65 billion in real terms. Now, these Quangos, people, things like, Social Work England, the Teachers Regulation Authority, the National Standards Authority, we can go on and on and on and on about all these authorities that have been set up. There's literally hundreds of them. There's Wilton House, that's a Foreign Office Quango. They're funded by the state, but not under the control of the state. That's why they're semi-autonomous. And it's absolutely mad that we, in real terms, we're massively increasing this funding. We should immediately reduce it to 100 billion. And we just literally say, well, we don't need that Quango anymore. We'll close that one down, or we'll stop funding it. I mean, if they can find funding from somewhere else, or well and good, let them find funding from somewhere else, and then they can continue. But if they can't find funding from somewhere else, they'll have to close. Some of them will just close. Some of them, like for instance the Financial Conduct Authority, well, we say we still need that. We can maybe examine it and reduce funding, but we'll maintain the funding. I'm not saying we should stop funding of all Quangos, but There's a lot of quangos which should just shut down. Others we should just say we should reduce their funding. But even to the things like the Financial Conduct Authority, we can say, I'm sorry, but you're costing too much. Next year we're reducing your funding, and you'll have to make some people redundant or whatever, because we think you're costing too much.
Is it just a coincidence that that 6 billion, perhaps it is, can be found quite easily? Because that's the exact amount that people, dodgy people, are doing universal credit. There's false claims everywhere to the quantity of £6 billion a year. But they wouldn't say that, would they, Labour?
Yeah, but the point I'm making is this is a relatively small amount of money. I mean, I'm talking about saving 124 billion immediately. And also there's the whole issue of government contracts. Government contracts cost about 379 billion last year. And they've put a social requirement on those contracts, and putting social requirements on them, according to the Adam Smith Institute, is costing about 10% extra. So that's 37 billion we could save. So I'm now talking altogether about saving something like 160 billion. Now you compare 160 billion with 6 billion, which is what Labour are talking about. They've got no intention of really getting to grips with where all this money is disappearing, because they support these quangos, because most of them are pursuing ridiculous, crazy, what you call deep state policies. And they're policies we don't want to be pursued. That's why we've actually got to stop the funding and get rid of them. That's the really sensible economic policy. Labour's economic policy is just utter waste of time. It's nonsense, frankly.
Well, we're going to end on a European note. It may be a bit of hope, actually. There's a real pushback again against the Green movement. Now, it's not just Britain. It's everywhere in Europe, largely, that are starting to get fed up. They see the price of electricity and gas. They see the price of food. And some bright spark has come along and said, well, listen, if we didn't have the Green movement, you're going to save 20% here, 50% there. Yes, the pandemic's had a bad effect. Russia has had a bad effect. But if you total it up and compare it with the effect of the Green movement, especially in Britain, my goodness me, no wonder we're in a mess again, Sid.
Yes, I mean, it is interesting that people are beginning to fight back. But people are fighting back against all this net zero stuff and ULEZ. I'm totally opposed, by the way, to these ultra low exclusion zones, because in my view, which I should say, you know, in our party's view, emissions from a car is part of the MOT. And if the emissions are too bad, then the car fails the MOT and they have to do something about the emissions for the car. It's no longer fit to go on the road. That's how we should deal with emissions from a car, not have some zone that you have to pay when you go into if you're driving a certain car. I mean, it's nonsense. It's utter nonsense. And these, frankly, all these exclusion zones should be banned. The exclusion should only be on the MOT. Simple. But you know, that's just one issue. But the whole agenda is beginning to fall apart. I mean, this whole idea that we've all got to go to battery cars, all of a sudden people buy these battery cars and then they find, oh, it's not working very well. I mean, to sit for an hour at a charging point. So, you know, I'm going to go back to a petrol car or possibly have a hybrid car. You know, there's a lot of people that have moved to battery cars that now want to move back to petrol cars. You know, suddenly they're not the solution for everything. They're finding that these windmills they've put up everywhere, they're now having to take them down because they only last about 20 years. So windmills that were put up 20 years ago are now having to be taken down, and they find that they can't recycle them all properly. So they've got problems with the windmills that they're now having to take down, and they suddenly find that putting windmills up is not the answer to energy. I mean, you know, they've got major problems.
Well, the dollar is at the bottom of all this, and I don't mean the American dollar. I just mean that in a generic term. It's all about money. The actual life of the windmill is 14 years, according to Siemens, who actually make the things, the inside of the motor. It costs a fortune in carbon footprint alone to produce the actual blades. The whole thing is a nonsense with EVs. We've had to get what they call a mild EV, electronic. That works thanks to one or two of the manufacturers who've now got common sense. Because if you put a small battery in a vehicle, it boosts the range, boosts the power, and it gets you into Madrid and Barcelona, because they won't let you in unless you've got some sort of electricity. Now, some sort of electricity is a nonsense to say, oh, I've got a second battery which will boost the power, but at least it overcomes silly laws. Yes, if you buy a complete electric car, boy, do you have problems. The actual tension, will I make it to the next, especially in Spain, where we're not blessed with the number of points. In Britain, it's a big enough problem. In Britain, it's not been thought out. But I'll tell you who has thought it out, particularly BMW and Toyota from different sides of the world. They've actually got the hydrogen one going. And that is the future, more than perhaps electric. But if we're realistic, Sid, it's a mixture of everything. In other words, dear old Margaret Thatcher got it right. You can't buck the market. Let the market do the sensible thing, and the right decision will come from the average Joe, not from certain World Economic Forums, people with agenda, and people that want to make a lot of money out of stupid governments. Can we agree on that, Sid?
Totally, absolutely.
Listen, it's been a short do this week. It's been a mad week. We've got so much to do and discuss, but we can leave that for another occasion. Thanks so much, Sid. We'll see you shortly.
Yeah, thank you.